Peeling away decades-old wallpaper, renovation contractor Mike Harmon freezes behind the faded floral pattern scratched into the plaster in childish handwriting. "Help me. Johnny was here 1969. His flashlight beam trembles across what appears to be a small handprint pressed into the wall. Outside, police sirens begin to wail through the quiet Nebraska neighborhood that never stopped wondering what happened to 12-year-old Johnny Brighton. Dawn breaks cold over Westbrook, Nebraska on November 8, 1969. Frost glitters on neatly trimmed lawns as Johnny Brighton zips his coat higher against the biting wind. At 12 years old, he's been delivering the Westbrook Gazette for almost a year now, his first real job. His breath clouds in the early morning air as he stuffs folded newspapers into his canvas bag. Don't forget, Mrs. Henley likes hers on. "The porch chair, not the step," his mother reminds him, handing over a thermos of hot chocolate. Carol Brighton is a petite woman with worry lines etched permanently around her eyes, deepened after her husband's death 3 years prior. "I know, Mom," Johnny says, rolling his eyes but accepting the thermos. "I'll be back by 7:30. Carol watches from the doorway as her son pedals away on his red Schwinn bicycle, newspaper bag slung across his chest. She can't explain the knot of anxiety in her stomach this morning. Maybe it's the unusual cold snap or the strange car she noticed parked down the street the past few days. Johnny's route takes him through the heart of Westbrook, a town of barely 5,000 souls where most everyone knows each other. He delivers to 38 houses, finishing with the wealthy north side where the new developments are springing up. The Caldwell house is his last stop, a grand 2-story colonial recently purchased by Dr. Raymond Caldwell, the town's new surgeon, and his wife Margaret. As Johnny approaches the Caldwell residence, he notices the garage door partially open. He's about to toss the paper onto the porch when Dr. Caldwell emerges, startling him. "Morning, Johnny," Caldwell says with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. "Pretty early to be out in this cold." "Yes, sir." Johnny shifts uncomfortably. Something about the tall, immaculately dressed doctor has always made him uneasy. "Say, since you're here, I could use some help moving a few boxes in the basement. My back's been giving me trouble." Caldwell pulls out his wallet. "I'll make it worth your while. $5 for 10 minutes of work." $5 is nearly a week's pay from his paper route. Johnny hesitates, remembering his mother's warnings about entering strangers' homes. But Dr. Caldwell isn't exactly a stranger, is he? He's a doctor. Everyone in town respects him. "I guess I could help for a few minutes," Johnny finally agrees. "Excellent. Just leave your bike in the garage." Johnny follows Dr. Caldwell inside, through an immaculate kitchen that smells of furniture polish and something medicinal. The basement door stands open, a dark rectangle leading downward. "After you," Dr. Caldwell gestures, his voice suddenly different, harder somehow. Johnny takes the first step down, then another. The stairwell is unnaturally dark. "Where's the light switch?" he asks, his voice echoing slightly. Behind him, the door clicks shut. The sound of a lock turning sends a jolt of panic through Johnny's chest. "Dr. Caldwell?" he calls, his voice cracking. No answer comes, only footsteps slowly descending the stairs behind him in the darkness. By 8:15 that morning, Carol Brighton has already called the police. Johnny's bicycle will be discovered 3 days later in Whitewater Creek, 5 miles outside town. The search for Johnny Brighton will become the largest in Nebraska state history, but the boy has vanished without a trace. Until now, 51 years later, when Mike Harmon's renovation team begins tearing down the walls of what was once the Caldwell home. Detective James Mercer arrives at the Brighton home by noon on November 8, 1969. At 34, he's the youngest detective on Westbrook Small, in police force, but also the most thorough. He sits across from Carol Brighton at her kitchen table, watching her hands tremble as she clutches a mug of untouched coffee. Johnny's never late, Never, Carol insists, her voice barely above a whisper. He knows I worry, especially since Frank passed. Mercer nods, jotting notes. Did Johnny mention any problems lately? Anyone bothering him on his route? Carol shakes her head, then pauses. Wait. Last week he mentioned a car following him, a dark sedan. I told him to be observant but not paranoid. Her voice breaks. Oh God, I should have listened more carefully. Mercer's partner, Officer Pete Dawson, enters the kitchen, removing his hat. We've got units canvassing the entire route. No sign of the boy or his bike yet. By nightfall, half. The town has joined the search. Flashlight beams crisscross through Westbrook streets, parks, and wooded areas as volunteers call Johnny's name into the darkness. Carol Brighton remains by the phone, a high school photo of Johnny clutched in her hand, his bright smile frozen in time. 3 days into the search, Johnny's red Schwinn is discovered partially submerged in Whitewater Creek, the newspaper bag, still attached but empty. The discovery sends a wave of dread through the search parties. This doesn't make sense, Mercer tells Dawson as they stand by the creek. The bike's here, but there's no sign of struggle. And why would Johnny deviate? 5 miles from his route? Could have been dumped here, Dawson suggests, lighting a cigarette, to throw us off. That same afternoon, Mercer interviews Dr. Raymond Caldwell, the last person on Johnny's route. I'm afraid I can't help you, Detective, Caldwell says, offering Mercer coffee in a pristine living room that smells faintly of bleach. I was performing emergency surgery at County General that morning. You can verify with the hospital. And your wife? Margaret was visiting her sister in Lincoln, returned yesterday when she heard the news. Caldwell's expression is appropriately concerned, but something in his steady gaze makes Mercer's neck hairs stand on end. Mind if I look around outside? The boy's route ended at your house. Be my guest, Caldwell says with a dismissive wave, though I assure you there's nothing to find. Mercer walks the property's perimeter, noting the freshly turned soil in the garden. When did you do this landscaping, Doctor? Margaret started it last weekend. She's quite the gardener. Caldwell stands in the doorway, watching. Is that relevant? Mercer doesn't answer, his attention caught by something partially buried in the soft earth, a small button that looks like it could have come from a boy's coat. That night, Detective Mercer requests a warrant to search the Caldwell property, but Judge Hamilton, a close friend of Caldwell's, denies it. One button doesn't justify tearing apart a respected doctor's home, he says. Find more substantial evidence. 2 weeks later, the FBI joins the investigation. Agent Diana West specializes in child disappearances and immediately zeroes in on the inconsistencies in witness statements. Several neighbors reported seeing Johnny enter the Caldwell home, she tells Mercer, reviewing case notes in the station's cramped back office. Yet Caldwell denies seeing him at all that day. Hospital records confirm he was in surgery, Mercer counters. From 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., West says, eyes narrowing. Johnny disappeared around 7 a.m. There's a 2-hour window unaccounted for. They drive back to the Caldwell residence, but find a sold sign on the lawn. A neighbor informs them that the Caldwells have suddenly relocated to Chicago for a prestigious medical opportunity. As they stand in front of the empty house, Agent West turns to Mercer. I've seen this before, the sudden move, the careful alibis. We need to find out everything about Raymond Caldwell before he came to Westbrook. But in 1969, without computers or cell phones, tracking someone across state lines means mountains of paperwork, endless phone calls, and bureaucratic roadblocks. By Christmas, the trail has gone cold, and Johnny Brighton joins the growing list of missing children whose faces stare out from post office walls across America. Carol Brighton refuses to give up hope, keeping Johnny's room exactly as he left it. Baseball glove on the bed, science homework half finished on the desk, waiting for a boy who never returned to complete it. May 1970 brings warm weather and new development to Westbrook. The Caldwell house sells to the Peterson family, who know nothing of its connection to Johnny Brighton's disappearance. Life in the small town attempts to return to normal, but Carol Brighton's hollow eyes and Detective Mercer's growing case file testify to the wound that remains unhealed. Mercer has converted his garage into an unofficial investigation center, walls covered with photos, timelines, and maps. His obsession with the Brighton case has cost him sleep, nearly his marriage, and the respect of colleagues who believe he should move on to active cases. "I traced Caldwell to Chicago," Mercer tells his wife one night. "But by the time I got approval to interview him, he'd moved again. Montreal now, supposedly." "James," his wife says gently, "it's been 6 months. You're destroying yourself." But Mercer can't let go, especially after discovering 3 other paperboy disappearances across the Midwest over the past decade, all in towns where Raymond Caldwell had briefly lived and worked. Agent West returns to Westbrook in June with disturbing news. "Raymond Caldwell isn't his real name," she reveals, spreading documents across Mercer's cluttered desk. "His medical credentials are impeccable but fabricated. We believe his real name is Richard Chambers, wanted for questioning in Pennsylvania regarding a similar disappearance in 1965. How did he fool the hospital? The medical board? He's intelligent, possibly trained as a medical assistant or orderly, knows enough terminology and procedures to pass." West hesitates. "There's more. The house, the Caldwell house. We need to search it properly." "The Petersons won't appreciate that," Mercer says, "and we still don't have enough for a warrant. Then we need to convince them to cooperate. Voluntary basis." The Petersons, a young couple with 2 small children, are understandably reluctant, but ultimately agree when presented with the circumstances. For 3 days, Mercer, West, and a forensics team from Lincoln examine every inch of the property. They find nothing until Mrs. Peterson mentions the basement wall they plan to knock down for a renovation. "It seems newer than the rest of the house," she explains, "and there's this strange smell sometimes like chemicals." Behind that wall, they discover a hidden room, roughly 6 by 8 feet. The space is empty except for a small cot, a sink, and scratches in the concrete floor. Luminol testing reveals significant blood traces, cleaned but not completely eliminated. "We need to tear up this floor," West says, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Mercer nods, already dreading what they might find, but the concrete yields nothing except more questions. The blood isn't enough to indicate a murder, and there are no remains. Instead, they find a child's belt buckle with the initial J and a small tape recorder hidden in the wall cavity. When they play the tape, the room falls silent as a child's voice, presumably Johnny's, speaks in terrified whispers. "My name is Johnny Brighton. He locked me down here, says no one will find me. If you're listening, please tell my mom I tried to escape. The doctor, he's not really—" The tape cuts off abruptly. The timestamp, scratched into the cassette label, reads November 10th, 1969, 2 days after Johnny disappeared. "He was alive," Carol Brighton whispers when Mercer plays the tape for her. "My boy was alive in that house while everyone was searching the woods." The revelation reignites the investigation. The FBI puts Richard Chambers Raymond Caldwell on their most wanted list. His photograph appears in newspapers nationwide. 2 weeks later, Margaret Caldwell is found dead in a Montreal hotel room, an apparent suicide with a note that reads only, "I never knew what was in the basement. God forgive me." But of Richard Chambers and Johnny Brighton, there is no trace. The case once again grows cold, becoming one of Nebraska's most notorious unsolved disappearances. Until 51 years later, when Mike Harmon's renovation crew makes their chilling discovery behind the wallpaper in what was once a child's bedroom on the 2nd floor of the same house, a room that, according to the original house plans, shouldn't exist. Mike Harmon, stands in the discovered hidden room, now cordoned off with police tape. The space is small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, and would have been completely undetectable had the new owners not decided to gut the second floor for an open-concept renovation. "We would have never found it otherwise," Mike explains to Detective Leah Keller, who's been assigned to the cold case. "The entrance was behind a bookcase in the main bedroom, sealed over and wallpapered. You'd never know it was there." Keller, 32 and determined, has spent the last 3 days poring over James Mercer's original case files. Mercer himself died in 1998, still haunted by his failure to find Johnny Brighton. "They searched this house thoroughly in 1970, she says, running a gloved hand along the wall where the message was scratched. "How did they miss this room? Look at the construction," Mike points to the ceiling. "It's built between the joists, uses the dead space between rooms. Whoever did this, new construction. And the bookcase entrance was seamless. We only found it because we were tearing everything down to the studs." Forensics technicians carefully document the room's contents. A small cot bolted to the floor, a plastic bucket in the corner, and most disturbingly, dozens of tally marks scratched into the walls grouped in sets of 5. The longest wall contains 312 marks. 312 days, Keller murmurs. "If these marks represent what I think they do." The most chilling discovery comes when they peel away more wallpaper, revealing childish handwriting that covers nearly every inch of the previously hidden walls. "My name is Johnny Brighton. I'm 12 years old, Mom. If you find this, I love you." Day 47. "He says if I'm good, he'll let me go soon." Day 112. "He's keeping someone else now, too. I can hear them downstairs." Day 200. "No one is coming for me." "Jesus," Mike whispers, stepping back. "He was alive in here for almost a year." Keller orders the entire house methodically dismantled, searching for any other hidden spaces. Ground-penetrating radar scans the property. Nothing more is found until they access the house's original blueprints from the county records office and discover significant discrepancies. The basement is 15 feet shorter on the east side than it should be according to these plans, Keller tells her partner, Detective Marcus Jones. "There's another hidden room we haven't found yet. Breaking through the basement's eastern wall reveals another concealed space, this one larger and disturbingly equipped with what appears to be medical equipment, an examination table, surgical, tools, and an old Super 8 camera on a tripod." Keller steps out of the room, removing her mask to breathe. "We need to find out everyone who's owned this house since the Caldwells, and I want to know if any other children went missing in this area between 1969 and now. Records show the house changed hands 7 times since 1970. The Peterson family sold it in 1973 after their youngest child began talking about the boy in the walls. Subsequent owners reported strange noises, cold spots, and in one case, a child's handprint appearing on a steamed bathroom mirror when no children lived in the house. Meanwhile, Carol Brighton still lives in Westbrook, now 90 years old and residing in Sunshine Meadows, assisted living. When Keller visits her with news of the discovery, the elderly woman's eyes fill with tears. "I always knew," she whispers, hands trembling as she touches a faded photograph of Johnny. "A mother knows when her child is still out there somewhere." "Mrs. Brighton," Keller says gently, "the evidence suggests Johnny was in that house for at least 10 months after his disappearance. The hidden room, the tally marks. He was alive much longer than anyone realized." "But where is he now?" Carol asks, her voice suddenly sharp with the same question she's been asking for 51 years. "If he left those messages, where did my boy go?" The answer begins to emerge when forensics identifies fingerprints in the hidden room that match not only Johnny Brighton's prints from his school records, but also those of 3 other children reported missing between 1970 and 1982, all from Different states, all cases gone cold, and most disturbing of all, a set of adult fingerprints that return a hit in the FBI database to a man named Edward Mercer, Detective James Mercer's son. The revelation hits like a thunderbolt. Edward Mercer, now 61, is the son of the very detective who investigated Johnny's disappearance. After his father's death in 1998, Edward moved away from Westbrook, reportedly to Seattle. His current whereabouts are unknown. This can't be a coincidence, Detective Jones says, as he and Keller drive to interview James Mercer's widow, Helen, who still lives in the same house where she raised Edward. The lead investigator's son? It's too bizarre. Helen Mercer, now 87, welcomes them with the wary politeness of someone who's seen too much tragedy. The living room walls are covered with family photos, many featuring James in his police uniform and young Edward, who bears a striking resemblance to his father. Edward was always a difficult child, Helen admits, after hearing why they've come. James was so consumed with the Brighton case that he didn't notice the signs. What signs, Mrs. Mercer? Keller asks gently. Helen's gaze drifts to a family portrait, taken around 1970. Edward was 15 when Johnny disappeared. He became obsessed with the case too, but differently. He collected newspaper clippings, followed James to crime scenes. Once I found him in the garage, studying all those horrible photos James had pinned up. Did Edward know the Caldwell house? Jones asks. Know it? Helen laughs bitterly. After the Petersons moved in, Edward befriended their son. He was there constantly. James thought it was good, Edward making friends after being such a loner. But looking back... She shudders. Edward was fascinated with that house. Said it called to him. As they leave, Helen presses a shoebox into Keller's hands. I found these in the attic after James died. I should have turned them in years ago, but he was my son. Back at the station, they open the box to find dozens of Polaroid photographs, clearly taken inside the hidden room in the Caldwell house. Some show Johnny Brighton, thin and terrified, holding a newspaper dated July 1970. 8 months after his disappearance. Others show different children, all with the same haunted expressions. Most disturbing is a journal written in Edward's meticulous handwriting, detailing his visits with Johnny and others. The entries span from 1970 to 1982, the father searches, while the son keeps the victim prisoner, Keller says, voice hollow with disbelief. It's almost too twisted to comprehend. Jones shakes his head. But why? What was Edward's connection to Caldwell? The answer emerges when they dig deeper into hospital records. In 1968, Edward Mercer, then 14, was hospitalized for 3 months following what was officially reported as a bicycle accident. His attending physician, Dr. Raymond Caldwell, FBI analysts confirm what they already suspect. The handwriting on Johnny's medical charts matches samples of Caldwell's writing from other documents. And Caldwell's treatment notes on Edward mention susceptibility to suggestion and potential candidate for special program. He groomed Edward, Keller realizes, used him somehow. When they search property records nationwide for Edward Mercer's name, they find nothing. But cross-referencing known aliases of Richard Chambers yields a hit. A cabin purchased in 1985 near Whitefish, Montana, under the name Edward Chambers. Satellite imagery shows the remote property sits on 20 acres of wooded land, accessible only by a single dirt road. Local authorities confirm the cabin is still occupied, supposedly by a reclusive writer who rarely comes to town. As the FBI tactical team prepares to raid the Montana property, Keller receives an unexpected call. Carol Brighton has suffered a severe stroke after hearing about the investigation's developments. The doctors don't expect her to regain consciousness. We need to move fast, Keller tells Jones. I want answers while she can still hear them. The raid is scheduled for dawn, but as night falls over Westbrook, the renovation contractor Mike Harmon calls Keller in a panic. Someone, "Broke into the house," he says, his voice shaking. "The hidden room. They took something from inside the wall. There's a hole punched through the plaster where there was no opening before." By the time police arrive, the intruder is gone. Security footage from a neighboring house captures a tall, slender man in his 60s, moving with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where he's going. "It's him," Keller says, staring at the grainy image. "Edward Mercer has come home." Dawn breaks over Whitefish, Montana, as the FBI tactical team surrounds the cabin. The operation, codenamed Paper Route, involves 30 agents, local police, and detectives Keller and Jones, who've flown in overnight from Nebraska. No signs of movement inside, the team leader reports as agents take positions. Heat sensors show one human-sized heat signature in what appears to be the basement. "He's there," Keller says, checking her weapon. "Let's bring him in." The raid proceeds with textbook precision. Within minutes, agents breach the cabin, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency. But the figure in the basement isn't Edward Mercer. It's a man in his early 60s, with haunted eyes and a heavily bearded face, chained to a wall. "Please," he whispers when Keller approaches, his voice raspy from disuse. "Is my mother still alive?" Back in Westbrook, Carol Brighton opens her eyes in the hospital room where doctors had given her hours to live. Standing beside her bed is Edward Mercer, now grey-haired but unmistakable from his father's photographs. "I brought you something," he says softly, placing a small object in her frail hand. A tarnished Boy Scout pocket knife with the initials JB carved into the handle. "He wanted you to have this." Carol's monitor begins beeping rapidly as a nurse rushes in. By the time hospital security responds to the alert, Edward Mercer has vanished. The man rescued from the Montana cabin is positively identified as Johnny Brighton through DNA testing and fingerprints. Now, 63 years old, Johnny has spent 51 years as a captive. First in the hidden room of the Caldwell house, then in a series of locations across the country, ending with the Montana cabin. It wasn't just Caldwell, Johnny tells Keller from his hospital bed, where doctors are treating severe malnourishment and other signs of long-term abuse. It was the boy, too, Edward. After Caldwell left Westbrook, Edward kept coming to the room. He'd bring food, water, sometimes a book or toy. Said he was my friend. "Did you ever try to escape?" Jones asks gently. Johnny's gaze drifts to the window. "Many times at first, but Edward would hurt me. Eventually, Caldwell came back for both of us. Said I was the perfect subject, and Edward was the perfect apprentice." The full horror emerges gradually through Johnny's fragmented recollections. Caldwell, whose real name was indeed Richard Chambers, had been conducting psychological experiments on children since the early 1960s, testing the limits of captivity, isolation, and psychological conditioning. Edward, himself a victim of Chambers' manipulation during his hospital stay, had been transformed from victim to accomplice. Chambers died in 1993, Johnny explains. Heart attack. But Edward continued everything. He'd been conditioned to maintain the experiment, brought new children sometimes, but always kept me. Said I was the original specimen. Forensic teams excavating the Montana property discover remains of at least 4 other victims buried on the grounds, all children reported missing between 1985 and 2001. But why would Edward return Johnny's knife to Carol now? Keller wonders. Why break into the house in Westbrook after all these years? The answer becomes clear when they analyze what was hidden in the wall of the secret room. A journal written by Chambers detailing his methodology and a series of Super 8 films documenting his experiments. He's tying up loose ends, Jones realizes. Edward knows we're closing in. A nationwide manhunt begins for Edward Mercer, now considered one of the most dangerous serial offenders in American history. His training under Chambers, combined with knowledge gained from his father's police work, makes him exceptionally elusive. Meanwhile, Johnny Brighton's reunion with his mother is bittersweet. Carol, barely conscious in her hospital bed, recognizes her son despite the half-century that has passed. "My boy," she whispers, touching his face with trembling fingers. "I knew you'd come home." Hours later, she slips into a coma. Doctors give her days at most. As Johnny maintains vigil by his mother's bedside, security camera footage captures Edward Mercer entering the hospital through a service entrance, wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag. By the time hospital security receives Keller's urgent warning, Edward has vanished again, but he's left something behind in Carol Brighton's room. A handwritten note addressed to Johnny that reads simply, "The experiment isn't over." Johnny Brighton's hospital room is placed under 24-hour guard. Carol remains unresponsive but stable, a small mercy that allows Johnny precious time with the mother who never stopped waiting for him. DNA tests confirm the blood traces found in the Caldwell house basement belong to Johnny and two previously unidentified victims. "I wasn't Chambers first," Johnny tells Keller during another interview session. His speech patterns are formal, institutional, the result of decades of isolation with only his captors for human contact. "There were others before me." He called them failures. "Failures at what?" Keller asks. Johnny's expression clouds. "Transformation." Chambers believed he could remake people, break them down and rebuild them with new personalities, new purposes. He looks away. That's what he did to Edward. The investigation takes a dramatic turn when Helen Mercer contacts Keller with a startling revelation. "I found more of Edward's journals," she says, voice trembling, "and photographs, dozens of them, children I don't recognize, and addresses, so many addresses. The journals reveal a horrifying pattern spanning 5 decades. After Chambers' death, Edward continued his mentor's work but expanded it. While keeping Johnny as his control subject, he abducted other children, subjected them to the same psychological conditioning, then released some of them back into society, but only after they'd been reprogrammed to serve as his eyes and ears. He called them sleepers," Johnny explains when shown the journal entries, "people who would appear normal but were actually extensions of Edward. He could activate them with specific phrases, make them do things, and they wouldn't even remember." Afterward, the FBI assembles a task force dedicated to identifying and locating these sleepers. The journal entries suggest at least 17 individuals were released over the years, now adults living seemingly normal lives across the country, all carrying psychological triggers implanted by Edward. "Some of them might not even know what was done to them," the FBI psychologist explains. "Their captivity experiences could be buried under false memories, accessible only through specific triggers." As the investigation expands, Keller remains focused on finding Edward himself. "He's still controlling this narrative," she tells Jones as they review security footage from the hospital. "The question is why? Why return Johnny now after all these years?" The answer begins to emerge when they identify one of Edward's sleepers, working as an orderly at Sunshine Meadows, the same assisted living facility where Carol Brighton had lived before her hospitalization. The man, Timothy Walsh, has no criminal record and has worked at the facility for 15 years. When questioned, Walsh appears genuinely confused. "I've worked here since moving to Westbrook," he insists. "I've never met anyone named Edward Mercer, but psychological evaluation reveals disturbing gaps in Walsh's memory, entire years he can't account for." Under hypnosis, a different personality emerges, one that refers to Edward as the teacher and admits to monitoring Carol Brighton for decades. The teacher always wanted to know about the mother, Walsh's alter personality explains in a flat, emotionless voice. "Every letter she wrote, every visitor, every time she mentioned Johnny, it was my purpose. Why was Carol so important to Edward? Keller asks. The experiment was never about Johnny, comes the chilling response. It was about her, about grief. The teacher wanted to measure how long hope could survive. This revelation stuns the investigation team. For 51 years, Edward had been studying Carol's unwavering hope as she waited for her son to return. Johnny wasn't just a victim, he was the instrument of a decades-long psychological experiment focused on his mother. The pieces fall into place when they discover a sophisticated surveillance system in Carol's assisted living apartment, feeding to a server in Helena, Montana. Edward had been watching Carol's reaction in real time when Johnny was finally returned to her. He's been orchestrating all of this, Keller realizes. The discovery of the hidden room, Johnny's return, everything. It's all part of his final experiment. Their urgency increases when Johnny's blood work reveals a troubling diagnosis. He's been systematically poisoned with thallium, a tasteless, odorless, toxic metal. The levels indicate he has months, maybe weeks to live. Edward's concluding his experiment, the FBI psychologist suggests. He's returned Johnny to Carol only to have her watch him die. As medical teams work to treat Johnny's poisoning, Keller receives an unexpected message delivered to the police station. A handwritten letter from Edward Mercer himself. Detective Keller, it reads. By now you understand the nature of my work. What you don't yet understand is that it's bigger than you imagine. The Westbrook house was just one node in a network that spans this country. You've found one subject, there are dozens more. And now that the final phase has begun, you have a choice to make. Continue pursuing me or save the others. You don't have time for both. Attached to the letter is a Polaroid photograph of a teenage girl holding today's newspaper. On the back, an address in Billings, Montana, just 3 hours from Whitefish. It's a trap, Jones warns. He's trying to split our resources. Or it's another victim who needs help, Keller counters. We can't ignore this. As the FBI dispatches a team to the Billings address, Johnny Brighton suddenly seizes in his hospital bed. When he regains consciousness, something has changed in his eyes. He's coming, Johnny whispers, gripping Keller's hand with surprising strength. Edward activated me too. I can feel him in my head. His eyes widen in terror. You need to sedate me before I hurt someone, please. Outside the hospital room, security cameras catch a figure moving through the hallway. Not Edward Mercer, but an elderly doctor who's worked at the hospital for 30 years. Another sleeper, hiding in plain sight. The Billings address leads to an abandoned warehouse where FBI agents discover not one victim, but a makeshift dormitory housing 7 teenagers, all reported missing from different states over the past 3 years. None show signs of physical abuse, but all display the same blank, affectless demeanor that Johnny sometimes lapses into. They're in various stages of conditioning, the FBI psychologist explains after initial evaluations. Some have been here for years, others just months. They all mention someone they call the teacher who visits periodically. Meanwhile, Johnny Brighton's condition deteriorates, despite aggressive treatment for thallium poisoning. His moments of lucidity become rarer as he struggles against what he describes as programming trying to take control. Edward altered all of us, he explains during one clear period, created partitions in our minds, different versions of ourselves that he could activate with specific phrases or sounds. Can you fight it? Keller asks. Johnny's expression is grim. I've been fighting it for 50 years, but he built fail-safes into all of us. If certain conditions are met, like my reunion with my mother, it triggers a countdown. Countdown to what? To when we become what he made us to be. Carol Brighton passes away peacefully in her sleep that night, never having regained full consciousness after her stroke. Johnny, sedated in his own hospital room, isn't told immediately, a decision the medical team makes to protect his fragile psychological state. The investigation expands exponentially as FBI data analysts cross-reference Edwards' journals with missing persons cases nationwide. They identify 43 potential victims across a 50-year span, forming a complex network stretching from Maine to Washington state. It's like a sleeper cell network, but for psychological experimentation, the FBI director explains during an emergency briefing. Chambers started it, but Edward Mercer expanded it far beyond what we initially thought. The most disturbing discovery comes when they identify one of Edward's earliest graduates, a man named Robert Winters, who was abducted in 1973 at age 11, held for 3 years, then apparently released. Now in his late 50s, Winters has risen to become a prominent child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. He's been treating victims of childhood trauma for decades, Keller says, staring at Winters' professional profile, including 3 children who were later abducted. When FBI agents move to apprehend Winters at his Minneapolis office, they find him dead from an apparent suicide, a cassette tape clutched in his hand. The recording contains Edward Mercer's voice giving specific instructions, followed by the sound of Winters' death. He activated Winters' self-destruct programming, the FBI psychologist explains. These people aren't just passive sleeper agents. They're fully programmed extensions of Edward's will. As the full scope of Edward's network emerges, Johnny Brighton's condition suddenly stabilizes. When Keller visits him, she finds him sitting up in bed, his eyes clearer than they've been in days. He's completed the first phase, Johnny says, without preamble. My mother's death was the trigger he was waiting for. How do you know Carol died? Keller asks, alarmed. No one told you. Because I can feel the programming advancing, Johnny replies. Edward designed this decades ago, a psychological experiment that would culminate after Carol's death. He wanted to see what would happen when her hope finally ended. Johnny's voice breaks. He used me as the instrument of her suffering for 51 years. What happens now? Jones asks. Now the network activates, Johnny says, his expression grim. All of us, everyone he's ever conditioned and released. There are hundreds, not dozens. Some don't even know what they are until the right stimulus reaches them. Johnny's revelation proves tragically accurate. Within hours, reports begin flowing in from across the country, seemingly normal individuals suddenly abandoning their lives, leaving behind confused families as they travel toward predetermined locations. Others commit apparently random acts of violence before taking their own lives. It's a dead man's switch, Johnny explains. Edward knew you'd eventually catch him, so he built this, a self-perpetuating psychological experiment that would continue even without him. The FBI establishes a national command center to track and intercept Edward's sleepers as they activate. Some are apprehended peacefully, others fight with surprising strength and coordination despite having no combat training. The conditioning alters their physical capabilities, the FBI psychologist explains. In high-stress situations, they can override normal physical limitations, similar to cases where mothers have lifted cars off trapped children. As the crisis escalates, Johnny Brighton makes a stunning request. I need to help you find Edward, he tells Keller. I'm connected to him in ways you can't understand. I can sense him sometimes, know what he's thinking. It's too dangerous, Keller objects. You're still recovering, and your programming is exactly why I have to do this, Johnny interrupts. I've spent 51 years as his prisoner. I know how he thinks better than anyone alive. He meets her gaze steadily. Let me help end this. Against medical advice, but with FBI approval, Johnny joins the investigation team as a consultant. His insights prove invaluable, helping them predict which sleepers will activate next and how to safely approach them. The breakthrough comes when Johnny recognizes a pattern in the activation locations. They form a perfect circle around Westbrook. With the Caldwell house at the center, he's coming home, Johnny says. Edward's final experiment ends where it began. As law enforcement establishes a perimeter around Westbrook, satellite imagery captures a lone figure approaching the town on foot from the north, walking calmly along the railroad tracks in broad daylight, making no attempt to conceal himself. Edward Mercer is returning to Westbrook, and Johnny insists on being there when they capture him. "I've waited 51 years to look him in the eye as a free man," Johnny says. "I need this." What Johnny doesn't tell them is that he can feel his own programming advancing with each passing hour, and that Edward has saved his most important sleeper for last. A light rain falls as Johnny Brighton stands at the edge of the police perimeter, watching the Caldwell house through binoculars. Despite the dozens of law enforcement personnel surrounding the property, Johnny feels strangely alone, trapped between the world he's returned to and the half-century of captivity that shaped him. "He's already inside," Johnny says quietly too. Keller, who stands beside him, "has been since before dawn." "That's impossible," she replies. "We've had the house surrounded since midnight." Johnny lowers the binoculars. "You're thinking of Edward as a normal suspect. He's not. This house has secrets you haven't found yet, passages, hidden spaces. He designed it that way from the beginning. The FBI tactical team has swept the house 3 times since establishing the perimeter, finding nothing. Yet Johnny's certainty is unshakable. After 51 years as Edward's prisoner, he's developed an almost supernatural awareness of his uncaptor's presence. "I need to go in," Johnny says. "Absolutely not," Keller responds immediately. "It's too dangerous. He won't reveal himself unless I'm there. That's the experiment's design, the final confrontation between subject and controller." Johnny turns to her, his eyes reflecting decades of pain. "This ends today, Detective, one way or another. After tense negotiations with the FBI command, a compromise is reached. Johnny will enter the house wearing a wire and a bulletproof vest, with a tactical team positioned to breach within 15 seconds of a distress signal. As Johnny approaches the house alone, walking up the same front path where his paper route ended 51 years earlier, he feels a strange doubling of time. The 12-year-old paperboy and the 63-year-old survivor occupying the same space. The front door stands slightly ajar. Johnny pushes it open and steps into the empty foyer. "I'm here, Edward," he calls, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Just like you planned." Silence greets him. Johnny moves deeper into the house, past the renovation equipment left by Mike Harmon's crew. The hidden room on the second floor has been fully exposed now, its walls removed to reveal the cramped space where Johnny spent nearly a year of his captivity. "You never understood what we were doing," voice suddenly says from behind him. "Even after all these years." Johnny turns slowly to face Edward Mercer. At 61, Edward is tall and gaunt, his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes as piercing as they were when he first visited Johnny in captivity. He holds no weapon, but carries a small leather satchel. "I understand perfectly," Johnny replies. "You and Chambers were monsters masquerading as scientists." Edward smiles faintly. "That's disappointingly simplistic, Johnny. We were conducting the most comprehensive study of human psychological endurance ever attempted. Your mother's unwavering hope, your adaptation to captivity, the integration of conditioned responses into your personality. It's all documented. Generations of psychologists will study our work." "No one will ever see your work," Johnny says. "The FBI has your journals, your recordings. They're dismantling your network as we speak." Edward's smile doesn't falter. "They've found what I wanted them to find, the surface level. But the real experiment?" He taps his temple. "It's all in here and in you." Johnny feels a cold dread spreading through him. "What do you mean? Why do you think I kept you alive all these years, Johnny? Why not just kill you after the first few years like Chambers wanted to?" Edward steps closer. "Because you were different, special, the only subject who never fully broke despite everything. You maintained your core identity, even while accepting the conditioning. Outside, the tactical team listens intently to the conversation through Johnny's wire. Keller signals them to hold position. Edward is talking, revealing information they desperately need. "I don't care about your justifications," Johnny says. "You stole my life." "No," Edward counters. "I transformed it, made it significant. How many lives touch thousands of others? But yours will, because you're my masterpiece, Johnny." He opens the satchel and removes a small device that looks like an old cassette player. And now it's time for the final phase. Johnny lunges forward to grab the device, but freezes mid-motion as Edward speaks a sequence of seemingly random words. Words that send electrical currents of recognition through Johnny's brain, activating dormant programming. Silverfish, carousel, domino, sunlight. November. Johnny's body goes rigid. His mind suddenly fragmented into competing personalities, the core Johnny fighting against the conditioned responses Edward implanted decades ago. Through the wire, Keller hears Johnny's breathing change. "Something's wrong," she says. "Move in now." But before the tactical team can breach, Edward presses a button on the device. A high-pitched tone fills the house, inaudible to the agents outside, but searing through Johnny's consciousness, activating deeper layers of programming. "What most people don't understand about conditioning," Edward explains conversationally, as Johnny struggles internally, "is that it's not about creating blind obedience. It's about creating conflict. The true experiment is watching how the authentic self battles against the implanted directives." Johnny falls to his knees, hands pressed against his temples. "What did you do to me?" "I made you the carrier," Edward says simply. "Every subject I've ever worked with is keyed to recognize certain stimuli from you, your voice, specific phrases. You're the trigger for the next phase." The tactical team breaches the house, agents flooding in with weapons raised. Edward makes no attempt to flee or resist as they surround him. "Edward Mercer, you're under arrest," the team leader announces. Edward smiles serenely as they handcuff him. "You're too late," he says, looking at Johnny. "It's already done." As they lead Edward away, Johnny remains kneeling on the floor, his mind a battlefield of competing impulses. What Edward activated isn't a simple trigger, it's a complete secondary personality, one that's been waiting decades to emerge. "Johnny?" Keller approaches cautiously. "Are you okay?" He looks up at her, his eyes clear again, but somehow different. "I think so," he says, "but something's changed. I can feel it." Later, as medical personnel examine Johnny, they find no physical changes, but psychological testing reveals alarming alterations in his cognitive patterns. "It's like parts of his brain have rewired themselves," the neuropsychologist explains to Keller. "Whatever programming Edward activated, it's fundamentally changing how Johnny processes information." Edward Mercer, now in federal custody, refuses to explain what he's done. "The experiment is self-documenting," is all he'll say. "Just watch." As night falls, Johnny Brighton sits alone in his hospital room, staring at his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him is both familiar and strange. The same man, but somehow fundamentally altered. And somewhere deep in his mind, a timer is counting down. 3 months after Edward Mercer's arrest, the full scope of his network has been uncovered. 78 former victims have been identified and are receiving specialized treatment. Edward himself remains in federal custody, facing multiple life sentences for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder. Johnny Brighton has moved into a small apartment in Westbrook, struggling to rebuild some semblance of a life after 51 years of captivity. The process is complicated by the psychological changes Edward's final trigger initiated, changes that continue to evolve in ways that baffle the specialists monitoring him. "It's like my brain is reorganizing itself," Johnny explains to Keller during one of her regular visits. Memories I didn't know I had are surfacing. Skills I never learned are becoming available to me. The most startling development is Johnny's sudden ability to recall with perfect clarity every interaction he ever had with Edward or Chambers, conversations, experiments, observations they made when they thought he couldn't hear. They were creating a human archive. Dr. Eliza Chen, the FBI's lead psychologist on the case, explains. Johnny's mind was conditioned to store and eventually access decades of research data, their ultimate backup system in case their physical records were destroyed. This realization transforms Johnny from victim to key witness. His testimony becomes central to the federal case against Edward, his perfect recall providing details that corroborate evidence from dozens of crime scenes spanning 5 decades. He embedded their entire methodology in my subconscious. Johnny tells the grand jury, every technique, every subject, every experiment, it's all in my head now, like a library I can walk through. But this gift comes with a terrible price. As Johnny accesses these implanted memories, he also experiences the emotional states associated with them, including Edward's detached scientific satisfaction and Chambers' cruel pleasure. Sometimes I can't tell where their thoughts end and mine begin, Johnny confesses to Keller one evening as they sit on a bench overlooking Whitewater Creek, where his bicycle was found half a century ago. What if I'm becoming them? You're not, Keller says firmly. You're exposing them. There's a difference. Thanks to Johnny's testimony, Edward's case never goes to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he accepts a plea deal. Multiple life sentences without possibility of parole in exchange for cooperating with authorities to identify and help his remaining victims. During their final authorized meeting, conducted through glass in a maximum security facility, Edward regards Johnny with something like pride. You're the proof that it worked, Edward says. The perfect synthesis of authentic identity and programmed response. Neither fully overriding the other, but creating something new entirely. I'm not your experiment anymore, Johnny replies. I'm dismantling everything you built. Edward smiles. That's exactly what you were designed to do in this phase. Don't. You see, even your rebellion was anticipated, encoded. You're fulfilling the program perfectly. Johnny leaves the prison shaken, but determined. Whatever Edward believes, Johnny is committed to using his unique position to help other victims, not as an unwitting agent of Edward's design, but as an act of personal reclamation. 6 months later, Johnny establishes the Brighton Foundation, dedicated to locating and treating victims of psychological manipulation and captivity. The Foundation's first initiative is a specialized treatment center housed in a new building constructed where the Caldwell House once stood, a deliberate transformation of a site of horror into a place of healing. We can't erase what happened, Johnny tells the small crowd gathered for the opening ceremony, but we can choose what happens next. Among the attendees is Helen Mercer, Edward's mother, now confined to a wheelchair but determined to witness this moment. I brought something for you, she tells Johnny privately after the ceremony, pressing a small object into his hand, a worn house key on a faded red keychain. James kept it all these years. It was found with your bicycle but never logged into. Evidence. I think he knew on some level that Edward was involved. Johnny closes his fingers around the key. His key from that November morning in 1969. Thank you, he says simply. That night, Johnny stands in his apartment looking out at the lights of Westbrook. The town has changed in countless ways since he delivered papers along its streets as a 12-year-old boy, yet something essential remains the same. The grid of streets, the curve of the creek, the silhouette of hills against the sky. On his desk sits a journal, not Edward's, but his own. Its pages contain not just memories of captivity, but fragments of the life he might have lived, imagined graduations, careers, relationships that exist only in the landscape of his mind. Next to it stands a framed photograph of Carol Brighton, smiling from her hospital bed during their brief reunion. Johnny touches the photograph gently. "I made it home, Mom," he whispers. As he turns away from the window, Johnny catches a glimpse of his reflection. No longer the paper boy who vanished, nor entirely the prisoner who returned, but something new. A survivor charting his own course through unimaginable circumstances. In his pocket he carries the key Helen gave him, not as a reminder of what was taken, but as a symbol of what can never be locked away, the human capacity to endure, to recover, and ultimately, to transform trauma into purpose. The Brighton Foundation will eventually help identify and treat over 300 victims of Edward and Chambers' network, dismantling what Edward once called his legacy and replacing it with something neither. Captor could have anticipated healing. In the decades that follow, experts will study the case of Johnny Brighton, the paperboy who disappeared and the man who returned, as both a testament to the darkest potentials of psychological manipulation and a powerful example of resilience in the face of calculated cruelty. But for Johnny himself, each day is simpler, a continuous act of reclamation, one memory, one choice, one human connection at a time. The experiment is over, the story continues,